Let's go
Good
ahead,
evening,
Valerie.
good evening, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Justice Beyond tonight. This is a great forum tonight, a very important forum. So, with that in mind, we are asking everybody please to respect one another because everybody comments, concerns, and questions is very important because this is affecting our livelihood, our lives in our areas that we live in. So, please be respectful. And also, we are asking everyone to share this very important form with your social media, with your network, with your email, anybody who you can connect to. Please share this forum tonight. We're asking again to spread the news of the good news of the redirection. Thank you, Pastor
Amen.
Manning, for this short commercial.
Thank
Amen.
you. Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Listen, everybody, just a couple of words about justice and beyond, some housekeeping issues for those of you that have not joined us for a forum in quite some time. So we've been on this platform here ever since the pandemic. And we hope maybe one day that we'll be back together again. We do know that COVID cases are on the rise, and so we want to be very mindful of that. But do know this, that we are steadily working for justice to especially amplify the voices of brown and black people and the issues that are impacting those that are most vulnerable. I know that we have been doing this organizing for about a decade now. And we plan to continue this work as we fight in the areas of criminal justice, housing justice, education justice, environmental justice, as we continue to do work in the river parishes. And so know that we operate by what we call a pillar system, PILLAR, pillar system. And what that means is that we have organizations and individuals that have signed up to be a part of the leadership and the vision casting of Justice and Beyond. We always want to add to that group. We want more people to help us. And so if you are interested, then you can join us for our planning meeting that is on Tuesdays at noon on this very same link. If you have a lunchtime that you can give to us, we greatly appreciate that. And so know that we just want to continue to do this work and to fight for justice wherever we can. So with that said, know this tonight that we're going to begin with the introduction of our panelists that we are very grateful are here joining us tonight. And then we will hear their answers to some questions that we've pre-written. And then after that, at around 6 o'clock, we will take questions for those who are in attendance on this forum tonight. And so if you want to put your question in the chat, we'll kind of save those questions to 6 o'clock. But if you want to put them in the chat so you don't forget them, that's fine as well, too. And so with that said, let's go ahead and begin tonight with this very
Yeah, they were
important.
being sent to my junk mail.
I hear one phone. I think probably our technical support team is going to mute that person. But if you would just go ahead and mute your phones, that would be great. All right, everybody. My name again is Pastor Gregory T. Manning. I'm the pastor of Broadmoor Community Church, where no perfect people are allowed, and the co-moderator for Justice and Beyond. Welcome, everybody. I want to introduce to you our panelists for tonight. Victoria Wenger, welcome. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for having me tonight.
All right, we're so glad that you're here. Each panelist, I'm going to ask that you would just give us about a minute and a half of introduction of yourself, what work you're engaged in, why the conversation tonight is so important to you. So, Victoria, thanks for being here tonight with us. Would you give us an introduction?
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much for having me here tonight. My name is Victoria Wenger. We're all friends now, so you can call me Tori. I am an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. That is our full name. You can call us the Legal Defense Fund, or LDF. By way of background, the Legal Defense Fund was founded over 80 years ago by Thurgood Marshall, originally as the legal arm of the NAACP. We later became a separate nonprofit, but we carry on the legacy and the shared commitment to defending and expanding the rights of Black Americans. That includes multiple different pillars of our work, whether that's dating back to our efforts leading up to the Brown v. Board of Education decision and desegregation. We continue to work on desegregation cases across Louisiana and the nation. We work on justice, reform, police accountability, ending the death penalty, a variety of other things in the criminal legal sphere. And we also work on economic justice. And then finally, political participation, which is my specialty and what I work on. I am a voting rights litigator and an organizer at heart. I am based at our national offices up in New York City, but my heart is truly in Louisiana, because I would say 99% of the work that I do is related to Louisiana, whether that is filing lawsuits on behalf of Black voters against the state to expand and defend voting rights, or to ensure that there are fair districts at every kind of level of leadership across the state. Louisiana is really where I have found my legal purpose, but I'm also very, very proud to work on get out the vote efforts, registration, whatever else we can do to support grassroots organizations and coalitions and people and voters like yourself. So I am delighted to be here virtually tonight and hoping to see many of you in the near future in person as we start to move across the state to train up volunteers for election protection and other efforts. And as we head to court, which I will talk about more later, because we've got some trial and hearing dates upcoming on these exact redistricting cases that we'll discuss.
Very good. Tori, thank you for being here tonight, all the way from New York City, right?
Indeed, proudly here in Queens.
All right, very good. What's the temperature there right now?
Too hot for me, but probably nice and cool for y'all.
Well, then that means we don't want to know. We're so glad that you're here, and you made the case for why we continue to do this on Zoom, so we can have good people and experts like you be a part of this conversation, and much needed. Next is our good friend, Peter Robbins Brown. Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, good to see everybody. I think this is about the 17th or 18th panel discussion that Tori and I have done together on redistricting. So if we fumble at this point, it's really kind of, I don't know what's going wrong. We should have it down to a science at this point. It's good to see a lot of friends on here. You know, Pastor Manning and I, we've been working together on stuff for years. Reverend Jim, Belinda Parker Brown. We also have a few of our college fellows on the call who wanted to join and check this out. I am the executive director of an organization called Louisiana Progress. We are a political advocacy organization. Our office is in Baton Rouge, but I live in New Orleans and do a lot of back and forth between those two places and go around the rest of the state quite a bit. We work on a lot of different issues. Redistricting was one that we were very active on, particularly around organizing and working on in the state legislature, working on some local government redistricting. We also work on issues that we call decriminalizing poverty. So we look at the ways that poor folks get swept up into the criminal justice system, often through things like minor drug offenses and traffic offenses, how they can get trapped there through excessive fines and fees. Louisiana relies on criminal fines and fees to fund its judiciary more heavily than just about any other state. And then the government debt collection scheme that's kind of fueled by that. So we look at that. That's one of the big issues, and we kind of go piece by piece through that continuum and do a lot of reform around that. We work on environmental issues, civil rights issues, and other social justice issues that come up predominantly at the state legislature, but also in local governments. And we have our College Fellows program, where a bunch of our folks are on the call today, and they are students from Southern University, LSU, Tulane. They do amazing research. They're wonderful people, wonderful. I hesitate to call them kids. They're young adults. I don't know, what the proper term is these days. But they're here to listen, and then also hopefully you'll be seeing them in the near future doing presentations on the stuff that they're researching and learning about, or maybe running for office or running a government agency or something. That is the goal of the program, is to train up the next generation of leaders. So hopefully a few of those names on this panel today will, down the road in the not too distant future, be filling those roles.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate you being here. And let's see, my good friend, Edgar Cage, give us an introduction, if you would, Edgar.
I don't see Edgar, but I'll shoot him a quick text and
okay.
And tell him to get to his nearest computer.
Yeah. Okay. And all right. Very good. Let's go ahead and begin then with some questions as you do that, Peter. I appreciate that. So we want to, in as much as possible, kind of catch everybody up and give a little background. And so the question that I posed to you is, how did we get here? If you can sum that up in as much as possible way, so that those that don't feel that they have all the information about background can get that information. Tori, would you do that? Would you begin with that, please? And then Peter will add to it.
Sure, absolutely. So first, to define where we are, where is here when it comes to the question of redistricting and the fight for fair maps in Louisiana. Where we are is in the courts right now. Specifically, we're in the federal court system, multiple different layers of it, and I'll get into that. But we had to go to the courts under the Voting Rights Act, specifically Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, because the state last year, legislative leaders who represent each of you decided to defy the dictates of the Voting Rights Act as it was passed in 1965 and as it was habitually reinstated and renewed. They decided to ignore decades and decades of precedent that essentially said that where you have factors in place, as Louisiana does, where there are noted patterns of racially polarized voting, where there are populations of Black voters who are right now constituting a large enough portion of the population to be able to draw more districts to represent them, where those factors align, where there's a history of discrimination, where there are persistent trends, unfortunately, of racial disparity and discrimination in the state, where all of those factors coalesce, there is a real Voting Rights Act claim. And the legislature decided we might see some of that. We might know this to be the reality. And certainly we were forced to hear from so many of our constituents about this reality because people truly showed up during the whole redistricting process. They took all that information, they said, doesn't matter, we're going to stick with the status quo. And what they did on the congressional level was pass a map that continued to only have 1 out of 6 districts comprised by a majority of Black voters. You all likely know that 1/3 of Louisiana's population is Black. I went to law school. I don't know, calculus, a lot of math these days, but I do know that 2 out of 6 equals 1/3. And while the question is not proportionality, it's about fair representation and equity, the opportunity for Black voters to be represented. The math didn't align, the testimony, the efforts of community were not honored, and instead the legislature pushed forward with a discriminatory congressional map. They also were charged with redistricting their own districts. So the state house, the state senate, they drew maps for those, and they again failed to provide opportunities for Black voters to elect their candidates of choice by having a majority in more districts than currently provided for. And at the same time, there's been other litigation about the state Supreme Court. There are other maps that are being passed at the local level that also are not providing for fair opportunities for Black people in Louisiana to exercise their political power. So how we ended up here is essentially, having a robust Voting Rights Act passed decades ago with the protections to create fairness, with a legacy of being the most robust piece of civil rights legislation in our nation's history. We come into that history with that as a fact, but with the reality in Louisiana being that wasn't enough. And instead, we had to go to the courts to ask for what should have just been provided through the legislative process. And we filed lawsuits last year, but they were essentially held up pending a similar case in Alabama. Alabama's legislature did the same thing. They heard all the testimony, they got all the legal briefing about what the Voting Rights Act required, and they ignored it, and they passed a map that failed to create a new Black majority congressional district. That went up, another LDF case, all the way to the Supreme Court, Allen v. Milligan. And I think that Louisiana, a lot of different legislative bodies across the nation were anticipating that that case could have been the end of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the section that essentially prohibits racial discrimination in the redistricting process. And luckily, we got a very good ruling on that case. In fact, it affirmed 40 years of precedent, it affirmed all those rules of the game that the legislature in Louisiana should have honored, and the legislature in Alabama should have honored from the beginning. And so once that case came down earlier this spring, everything started back up in action. So we are now in multiple courts at multiple iterations of our litigation process, fighting for fair maps. So happy to get more into the weeds on all of that, but I don't want to take too much time. I want to let the other folks talk a bit about where we are and how we got here.
Thank you, Tori. That was pretty comprehensive. I appreciate that. We all appreciate that. Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Tori covers the legal side of it, the history side of it, as well as anybody you're going to find. So y'all are also very lucky that she's on the call, because you're not going to miss anything. She's got it all down. I think one part, and this is often where I can kind of come in and talk about, is the politics of it, right? The kind of the nitty gritty of it. Why, right? I think that's ultimately the question. Tori laid out the legal case, right? Like, there were 40 years of precedent. Legislators in Louisiana, Alabama, other places knew that they were violating that precedent, right? And so the question is, why? And it's certainly probably first and foremost about race and about blatant racism and but as part of that larger story, it's about political power. And it is about an effort, a concerted effort. This wasn't just a few legislators in Louisiana kind of working on their own, or a few legislators in Alabama saying, we want to, rig the system here in Alabama. It's a concerted national effort that's been going on for decades. Tori talks about 40 years of legal precedent. For just as long, if not longer, there has been a move, a long-term move to strip that legal precedent, to destroy that legal precedent. It was somewhat successful, or partially, got part of the job done in 2013 in the Shelby v. Holder case, where what was called pre-clearance was taken out. And what it used to be is that places like Louisiana and Alabama, with histories of racist power dynamics, had to get their maps signed off on by the Department of Justice before they could enact them. That got taken away. So now, I mean, the reason that we kind of had to do this on the back end, or that all of this came on the back end, was because of that, right? And I think that was part of why there was an expectation, as Tori mentioned, that the Supreme Court was going to do away with this last part, this sort of back end remedy. And it was a wonderful surprise that they didn't. And so it gives us this legal remedy. It allows Tori and her team to, take this to court and say, look, we've got the ruling now, this is what we need to do. As citizens, as folks who are part of the political process, and sometimes can feel maybe a little bit powerless in this dynamic, right? That it's elected officials and lawyers and, courts. The reason that Tori and her team are going to be able to make a good case, that they already were able to make a good case, was the advocacy that was done on the ground leading into this, right? When those lawyers who, might seem removed from us are arguing it in court, they are using the work that citizens like us did to advocate and to say this approach that you're trying to take is wrong. But it's also important that we understand the ongoing nature of this, right? So these cases will, almost definitely be resolved through the courts. And I think we'll probably talk about what that might look like on the back end. Tori will be able to give a very clear legal discussion of it, and I'll wildly speculate, as I tend to do. But however it comes out, it's really because of citizen advocacy that is the foundation. And just because this national power structure that was trying to strip the Voting Rights Act lost in this battle does not mean that they're going home, right? And saying, like, we're done. And so it's going to take us continuing to work, continuing to provide, to push back, provide the counterbalance, the people who say, no, actually, fairness does mean something. Equality means something. Equity means something. Democracy means something. We're the ones who are going to have to, again, for the next battle, whatever that may be, it's going to be built on our foundation as citizen advocates.
Yeah, absolutely. As long as racism exists, then we will always continue to fight this battle just the same. It's just like any other system that we need to dismantle racism in. So thank you for making that point. Did we get Edgar on the line yet?
He has not responded. Okay. I'll tell you what. Let me jump off. I'm going to jump off camera. And I'm just going to call him. And I'm going to get mad.
I need to report on that. I just
go.
called him, and he's not feeling well. He had a little minor surgery, so he won't be able to jump on.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. We will certainly be lifting him up in prayer. Thank you for that update. And Peter can come back. You may still be calling him, but Tori. So we need to understand and could use more information about the Voting Rights Act sections and where they stand now. Could you just fill us in? I know you gave us a little bit, but can you give us any more information?
Absolutely. And Peter teed this up well also. So this will be a little bit of Voting Rights Act 101. So again, Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 as the product of mobilization of people marching from Selma to Montgomery, folks from Louisiana and beyond mobilizing and really forcing the legislature up in DC to make moves to pass this robust, comprehensive bill to defend voting rights. And there are several different sections that really have been hailed as the heart of the Voting Rights Act and that are at the center of these contemporary debates and cases that we're talking about. So I'm going to start with Section 4 and Section 5. So Section 5 is the one that Peter was mentioning was at the heart of that Shelby County v. Holder decision back in 2013. So 10 years ago, there was a case challenging Section 5 and Section 4B specifically. The two of those sections together were around this idea of preclearance, about the idea that states with the worst histories and jurisdictions, didn't even have to be a whole state, but any area where there was a record of discrimination in voting that was so egregious that you essentially could not trust that place and its leaders to do right by Black voters, especially, but other communities of color, protected voters, whether it's in passing bills or enacting maps. Section 5 provided for that idea of preclearance, the idea of federal vetting, of getting approval from the federal government before you could move forward with your maps or move forward with your voting laws or other administrative policies, like if you're going to move a polling site, you're going to implement an ID policy or anything like that. Preclearance was that heart of Section 5. The states and jurisdictions that policy, that Section 5 applied to, were defined in what was called the coverage formula under Section 4B. So Section 4 is what said who this applies to: Louisiana, Texas, a bunch of different places, all the way up to the north in some instances. Section 4B decided the who's who of needing preclearance coverage. Section 5 was describing what preclearance was, what it involved. So the fear in Shelby County v. Holders really that they would gut all of that they would get rid of Section 5 too. What they did instead is essentially say that Section 4B was outdated. It was unfair to these jurisdictions. And the Supreme Court kicked it over to Congress and said, you could come up with a new coverage formula, and that could essentially revive the power of preclearance, revive Section 5. Has Congress done that though in a decade? Absolutely not. There is legislation that's been filed, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. There have been efforts to revive a new formula, a new policy for preclearance coverage. They have not yet succeeded. So this was the first redistricting cycle where we did not have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act, specifically preclearance. So Louisiana was one of those jurisdictions with such an egregious history of voter suppression and discrimination that the whole state was covered by preclearance. So what does that mean for Louisiana? Well, I think a lot of people assume, hey, had we had pre-clearance, Louisiana would have had a map with 2 Black majority districts. Can't necessarily say that definitively. What pre-clearance was really looking for was whether or not the map or the current policy was taking Black voters backwards, was looking at the baseline you had before. Is this reducing the opportunities created for that community or not? That's why Section 4, Section 5 alone are not the full gamut of protections that myself and other civil rights and voting rights attorneys rely on or look to when defending the rights of the communities and the clients that we serve. We have Section 2, and Section 2 is exactly the area of law that we are litigating on right now, and that really the private bar, the entities other than the federal government, the DOJ, and the system were able to use all along to defend the rights of Black voters and other communities of color, protected voters across the nation. Section 2 essentially says, for purposes at least of redistricting, that you cannot create districts that deny Black voters, or again, other voters of color, an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. Now we have a bunch of legal precedent that helps us determine where that should apply. Again, some of those factors I was talking about before. Do you have enough Black voters to even constitute a new district? Because you have to have constitutional districts. They have to be balanced by population, this theory of one person, one vote. So are there enough Black voters? And then similarly, is it really necessary? Is voting so polarized across racial groups that, you know, Black voters are tending to vote for one candidate, but then a white majority where you don't have a Black majority district, which is most Southern states, either statewide or in the majority of their congressional or other districts, where you haven't actively created a majority for the minority community like Black voters in Louisiana. White voters are always voting in the opposite direction. We call that racially polarized voting. We seek actual analytical, mathematical data to back up whether or not that trend exists. But if all those conditions are met, if you can create compact districts with a majority of Black voters, and if it's really necessary to do that to provide these voters with an opportunity because of patterns of racially polarized voting, it's got to happen. So that whole precedent in Section 2, even after the Supreme Court's ruling this past cycle, that lives today. That is the standard we are litigating right now for multiple different maps in the state of Louisiana.
All right. Thank you so much for that redistricting 101. Appreciate that. The Voting Rights Act 101, that really broke it down for us very well. Thank you so much. Peter, you anything that you want to add to that?
Just to remind us that, you know, we do think of this in terms of Congress, right? And that is, I think, just the way that our brains go. It's the most talked about aspect, but it also applies to our state legislative, and as Tori talked about, our local maps. And so, again, sometimes things in DC can seem far away and removed and difficult to wrap our heads around. But the way that these court cases play out, or that the court case plays out around the congressional district, there are cases moving that Tori, I'm sure we'll talk about, dealing with the state maps, dealing with local maps. And so it is very exasperating, Darlene. This is, you know, I'm sorry, Darlene's comment got me, you know, the pre-clearance thing, like we wouldn't be having this call on redistricting. Hopefully we'd be here to talk about another important topic. But, you know, with pre-clearance, this whole, like, we have to go through years and years of court proceedings. And, you know, even now with a couple of years under, I don't want to say our belts, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not doing it, under Tori and her team's belts, we still have a ways to go before this is going to be resolved. And it's clear that the opposition is trying to drag this out to get another election cycle under these current unconstitutional maps. So it is very exasperating. And when we talk about Section 5 being gutted 10 years ago, I mean, that is, you know, that is a big part of the reason why it's so exasperating and why it continues to go on and on when we really shouldn't have gotten to this point in the first place. But sorry, getting back, Darlene, you got me off track, but I think in a worthwhile way, hopefully. So these legal cases and the Voting Rights Act, these are going to be, we have a statewide election coming up. It was under a map passed during that same redistricting session. I think that map is unconstitutional as well. It did not expand Black voting rights, Black voting access in the way that it should have to be representative of our state's population. As Tori mentioned, there's some local maps that have the same problems that we're still going to have elections this cycle under. And so when we look at the fact that we have a lot of incumbents running for the state legislature without any challenge, they've already been elected. When you look at the districts, there's essentially like there's 2, maybe 3 out of 144 legislative districts in our state, 2 or 3 that are potentially competitive between parties. So when we look at things that like it dampens the voting enthusiasm, right? Along with just having an issue of voting rights access, of civil rights, what it does to dissuade, dispirit voters when they don't have people to choose from, when somebody's just won because they're not challenged, or they don't feel like they're really making have a choice. Maybe there's sort of choosing between 2 variations of the same flavor of ice cream or something, or maybe it's not, they don't think of it as being as good an option as ice cream, but whatever. That is something that is a different way of attacking voting rights, right? And that's something that happens in more of a psychological way. And so when we think about where those cases could go on the state and the local level and the federal level, I mean, it's the same thing is happening in Congress, the lack of competition, the reduction to that. It's another way that, you can't necessarily attack legally in a sense, but it's something we need to think about the full gamut of ways that voting rights and voting access are being damaged by these forces who, are not, anti-democratic forces.
Yeah, that is such a good point, that it's just really creating this ugly stain on our democracy and causing a demise in it, and really doing what the powers that be want, is to create voter apathy. And then it all plays into why we're seeing such low voter turnout. If really it's not a fair system, then why should I show up and vote? Which is what many people are feeling right now, doing exactly what they wanted to do. Thank you for making that point, Peter. Let me ask this: if y'all would just go into explaining, and we again, a couple of these questions are kind of overlapping, but want to explain the 2 lawsuits that we're dealing with right now, did I ask that one? I may have already asked that one. Did I?
Excuse me, Pastor Manning.
Yes.
This Sylvia, they have the.
Hey, Sylvia. Yes, Sylvia. Okay.
Because I haven't seen them in the participants. That's why I asked.
No, you blanked out for a minute there. I didn't get your question.
Okay, I say that's why I asked, because he wasn't in the participants yet. So I wanted to know, have he replied to Peter's text?
Oh yeah, no, Edgar is under the weather, and so he won't be joining us. Okay.
All right.
You asked if you had asked the question about the 2 different suits in Louisiana.
Yeah, I don't think I did.
I don't think you did.
Okay, thank you, Lane. Tori, if you could explain, give us the kind of one-on-one version of those 2 lawsuits and what exactly they are.
Absolutely. So first you have Robinson v. Ardwin. So Robinson is one of our named individual plaintiffs. We have several voters that we're representing in that matter. It's the Legal Defense Fund, along with the ACLU and some other supporting firms and local attorneys who are litigating that, but it's on behalf of the State Conference of the NAACP, Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, and individual voters as well. But the ramifications obviously are for everyone statewide in Louisiana. That case is about the congressional map. It's the one where we are essentially saying that there should be a second majority Black district for Louisiana's delegation to Congress up in DC. And that case has been in an interesting posture. So it was filed essentially immediately after the map was passed last year, and was filed in a variety of different courts. You might remember there was a very concerted push from members of the community. Some of the plaintiff organizations were representing to have the governor veto the map that was enacted. And then the legislature convened in a somewhat unprecedented way and overrode that veto as well. So once the map was finalized through that legislative process, the lawsuit was filed in federal court in Baton Rouge. We went through with a full preliminary injunction hearing. So we still have not gone to a full trial yet, but because the elections were upcoming, we essentially asked for emergency relief. So we had what felt like a trial, a preliminary injunction hearing on the initial question, which was, did the state of Louisiana violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act by enacting a map that only maintained this one Black majority district, essentially running from New Orleans and meandering all the way up towards Baton Rouge to really pull in that entire Black population across that full region. And after that trial, after incredible testimony from our plaintiffs and witnesses, we got a great ruling from the district court, which was inevitably immediately appealed up to the Fifth Circuit. And there was also all this kind of maneuvering on this question of timeliness. We're too close to the election to even be asking this question or fighting for a new map. So a bunch of different postures here, but essentially everything on that question of, do we even have time to address this year, got up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, hold up, before you move forward with coming up with a new map, because we got a favorable ruling from the district court on that question of, is the state liable? Before you do all that, pause. We are too close to the election. It'll cause voter confusion. You got to wait until we determine the next chapter of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in our Alabama case. So that Alabama case went to oral argument in October. We got a decision this June. And all the while, we were in a holding pattern with our case in Louisiana. That pause from the Supreme Court last year literally came on the eve of what would have been our next step, which was going back to the district court and getting what we call it a remedial map, essentially having the court consider the different options and choose a new map for us. So we didn't get that far, but we are going back on October 3rd through 5th. We will have that remedial hearing for that temporary new map that is the outcome of us winning on that preliminary injunction. Now, I add in all this legalese with preliminary injunction and everything else, all to say that we still have to go to a full trial on that, but we are very optimistic that we will have a new status quo map, a new map out of this remedial hearing in October saying, here is your second Black majority district. Here is another district where Black voters can actually have a choice that means something for the outcomes and representation for Congress in 2024 and hopefully beyond. So we'll keep up the fight after, but we are very optimistic of things to come after October. So that's the first case, that's Robinson.
Okay.
The next case, Peter and I have both alluded to, is about the state legislative maps. That's Nairn v. Ardoin. So Nairn, again, is one of our incredible individual clients. Dr. Dorothy Nairn's actually in both of our cases, so she's somewhat of an all-star, as are all of our clients, including Mr. Cage, in the Robinson case. So Dr. Nairn and other individual plaintiffs are also joined by Black Voters Matter and the State Conference of the NAACP in filing a lawsuit challenging the state House map and the state Senate map. Both of those maps are being addressed in this one lawsuit. That case was also put on pause pending the outcome of the Alabama case, because again, as we talked about, it wasn't just about Congress, it wasn't just about Alabama or Louisiana, it was about the future of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So it has a trickle-down effect to state legislature. The outcome had a trickle-down effect to parish level redistricting, municipal redistricting. The question was, what is the future of this area of law and really of one of the remaining productive pieces of the Voting Rights Act? So the district court, after the court observed what happened with our other case, essentially just put it on pause herself. And so this one, right after we got the decision from Alabama, and it was clear that the path forward for the Voting Rights Act was the same path we were on for 40 years. The law hadn't really changed. Supreme Court upheld it. Then we were able to pick back up where we were. So we are in the midst of the discovery process. So collecting all our evidence, doing our depositions, all that kind of fun lawyer stuff. But we'll be going to trial on November 27th. So pack your leftover turkey, whatever else y'all eat, whatever is filling those tables. I can only imagine your Thanksgiving cuisine down there in New Orleans. But pack it up and meet us in Baton Rouge, because we'll be headed to what is currently scheduled for a 2-week trial on that case. And hope really is to get more Black majority districts in both of those chambers.
Wow, is that date pretty solid? And we don't see that that's going to be moved at all?
No, the court is taking this seriously, and we're anticipating November 27th through December 8th. Could end up being shortened, and I will admit the state has been trying to delay or find excuses to push all of these things back. But we're optimistic that yes, we'll be spending a lot of time in the federal courthouse in Baton Rouge this fall.
All right. Moving forward, that's good. Thank you for that breakdown. Peter, anything to add to that?
Just Robert asked in the comments, is this all in legal hands, or is there anything the rest of us can do? Maybe the ultimate outcome is in legal hands, but Tori was just talking about, you can show up where, there's going to be some efforts around turnout. And, I am a big believer, people asked when I was doing a lot of organizing on sort of the front end of redistricting, there was this thought, it was a question I got asked basically every time. Aren't they just going to go into a room, decide what they want to do, and, carve up the map however they want to? It doesn't matter what we say or what we do. And I would always say, I don't know. All we can do is fight our fight. All we can do is, take whatever step forward we can as individuals and as groups. And so, Robert, to your question, is there something we can do in terms of showing up at the Capitol or, organizing events? Not necessarily, although we don't know where all this will go. But, everything from saying a prayer to talking to people, so that the awareness of this issue. I think one of the things that led to this victory in court this time, as opposed to how the Shelby v. Holder case worked out, is that 10, 15 years ago, people really were not thinking about redistricting. They weren't talking about redistricting. It was, it just was not on people's radars. And then partially because of the ruling in Shelby v. Holder, but because of a lot of the other things we saw over the 2000 teens, I guess that's what we call them, it became more and more people became aware of it. More and more people were involved, both as citizens and as lawyers and as elected officials, and all across the spectrum. And so the more that we lift up these cases and with our friends, with our colleagues, with our family members on social media, wherever we can, the greater the awareness is, the less likely we are to have to kind of go through this again during the next redistricting cycle, which is not that long down the road, scarily enough. But, this is part of it. And then going back to one thing I just mentioned earlier, because redistricting really is at the nexus of power, of political power. And ultimately what we're talking about here is trying to build political power for righteousness, for love, right? I never try to do this because it's a great quote. I could never do it as well as MLK himself, but he has this great quote about comparing power without love and love without power. And because there's a dynamic that I think we often think about, that if I'm somebody who is love-centered, who, that I shouldn't be pursuing power, or I shouldn't be in making that effort, because it dirties, it dirties love, right? And he talks about how love without power is anemic. What we see from the folks who are pushing these racist, unconstitutional maps is what he talks about as being power without love, right? It's cruel. And so we have to understand that pursuing power, pursuing political power, I'm not going to pretend it's just this clean business where there's nothing that, it all feels wonderful and rosy or whatever, but it's necessary. If we want to build a love-centered, compassion-centered society, which I think a group with the name Justice and Beyond does. That's why we're here. We have to take the notion of building, holding, and properly using political power seriously. And so, Robert, coming back to your question, I think that's something we can do. Talking about this issue, helping people understand how important it is to achieving the goals that I think we all share.
That's good. Very good. Thank you, Peter, for that. That certainly, absolutely, that's what we do with Justice and Beyond. As I alluded to in our prayer, is we fight for love and empathy and compassion, and certainly with everything that we're facing in this world right now, including the horrible impacts of climate change that we're seeing right now, we need to press those with power to see the need that is before them of the most vulnerable. That's where we stand. And what we ought to do. So thank you for that. Let me ask this question. So we talked about a little bit about what we can do. Realistically, what are the barriers that we're facing right now in thinking about winning these lawsuits and redistricting? What are those real barriers that we need to try to overcome? Tori?
So I think that, this has been thematic throughout, but, power is at the center of this. So, defendants here, anyone involved coming in from the other side of this issue is not going to go down without exercising every single mechanism, whether that's delay, novel legal arguments, whatever tool in their toolkit they're going to exercise. And I think there was, a thought that we'd be in a different landscape or reality for the posture of Section 2. But just because we got an incredible ruling from the Supreme Court that affirmed, a path forward we thought should be pretty obvious. Just, Alabama, go ahead and enact a map with another Black majority district. Louisiana, here's your path forward. The legislature could have fixed that map themselves. They had the opportunity. They have not. They're staying in the court. Similarly, Alabama went ahead and passed a map that didn't have another Black majority district, defying what the Supreme Court had forecast should be the next step, defying what the 3-panel judge had told them to do. Our colleagues were back in court last week on that exact issue, because it's just not that, the courts have said one thing, the law says one thing, history, fairness, principles of justice say one thing, and it becomes the reality the next day. So I think the fact that power is on the line here means that this is going to take a fight. It's also going to take time. So the legal process goes through many different iterations. As I mentioned, we haven't even gone to trial on the congressional map yet. So we've got to go through all of those paces to really get to a final conclusion. But that doesn't mean that we're not up for the fight, hydrated, or ready to go, and that we're not looking towards the next one as well. As Peter mentioned, the next census, the next redistricting cycle is right, on the horizon. We can already start mobilizing to make sure that people are familiar with the importance of taking the census. We can already start building the record towards the next case or the next legislative redistricting session. We can familiarize people with why this is important, why power is on the line in redistricting, and make sure that, our foot soldiers are there at the front. Whether it's, the front bench of these court hearings or, the front of the hall for the next redistricting session, or wherever else democracy is happening. Hopefully the front of the lines to the polls this upcoming November. The fight for democracy, the fight for voting rights and redistricting, it's not detached. Voting and showing up, documenting if you have any issues or face discrimination at the polls, that is also part of our record. That is also what courts are looking to today. That is also part of what Congress will be looking to if they ever pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So I think there's ways in which we can engage in civic society, in democracy, in building the voter pool and bringing people into democracy in ways that do directly impact this case more than you might know.
Mm. Thank you, Tori, and thank you. I saw a public service announcement about that the other day about what's happening at the polls and if there's any form of discrimination that you encounter, whether it's being dissuaded from getting in line or any negative ads that are out there that tell you that the lines are too long and don't show up. All of that needs to be exposed and amplified, and we need to tell that story. And if we see something, then we need to say something. All that adds to it. And thank you for making the point too that this is an ongoing process. It may not be done overnight, and the fight never stops. And we need to realize that not only our voting rights are on the line, so many other rights are being impacted as well too. And we're seeing democracy threatened each and every day. And so we just have to stay on our guard and stay on the battlefield. Let me ask this question
for a second. I want to quickly add to a similar PSA. If there's one thing you all do tonight, it's write down this phone number. 866 Our Vote is the National Election Protection Network, which is, staffed by the civil rights legal community, which dates back decades, and LDF and our partners at the national level and locally in Louisiana all ensure that has nonpartisan voter information accessible to anyone if you need help with registration, any other questions. But also, it is a direct line to report if there are any instances of voter discrimination, intimidation, or other issues leading up to or on election day. So that's 866 Our Vote. That's one active thing you can do is write down that number, put it in your phone, or share it with someone, because it really is a resource, and it's all from the civil rights and voting rights community.
We have power. We have power to do something and to say something and make our voices heard. We're our own best advocates. So y'all write down that number. Make sure you keep your eyes wide open. And Peter, anything that you want to add?
Not to add to that, but we're getting a lot of questions, really good questions in the chat that I would be happy to.
Let's
we're
move
at
to
that
those.
point.
Yeah, no, I just have one question on here. But the last question I have is, if North Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana win their cases, how does that help overall?
Well,
Tori,
I mean,
Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is that, I mean, if you really want to just talk about power and politics, I mean, the simple answer is that we're likely to see a few more seats that are likely Democratic seats that are likely to be represented by Black Congress people or folks who these majority or near majority Black districts choose to represent them, right? I mean, that was one of the discussions throughout the redistricting session. Was I think the opponents or the folks who were, in favor of the unconstitutional maps continued to kind of argue this idea that Black voters would only elect a Black person to represent them. And if you don't have a situation where it's guaranteed to be a Black elected official, I mean, it was some weird arguments. This goes to Jeff's question, which I think was sort of what are some of the specific tools of the opposition? They came up with all these just really weird, often contradictory arguments. I mean, I think part of the reason that even a lot of Trump appointed judges ruled in favor of LDF and their clients was that some of these arguments were just like, incredibly weird, contradicted themselves on their face. But throughout the entire redistricting session, we heard them in committee after committee going through them. So that's one of them, this idea that that Black voters don't have the sort of wherewithal to just elect the best person to represent them, that it had to be a Black representative representing Black people. Now, that might become the case more often than not, but I mean, we have several instances in the legislature right now of white elected officials representing Black majority districts. That's who the voters decided was best for them. And that's really the point, is that the voters in these majority Black districts decide who's the best person to represent their interests, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level. And so ultimately, what we've seen in the South in these states that you mentioned is that Black voters do overwhelmingly, going back to Tori's comment about racially polarized voting, overwhelmingly tend to vote for Democratic candidates. And given the very slim majority that the Republicans currently hold in Congress, these changes would likely be either enough to flip or put it right on the edge. So it's these very, just a few seats here in the South could really flip the power dynamic in Washington, D.C., depending on these outcomes.
Okay, very good, very important. Tori, do you have anything to add to that before we go to questions from our participants tonight?
I think that summarized it well. I think just really coming back to Peter's point that, wins on the Voting Rights Act are a win for voters. The Voting Rights Act protects voters. It doesn't protect parties. It doesn't protect elected officials. It protects voters having an opportunity to choose who they want to lead, and having more cases that are building that record, that are building upon the legacy that John Lewis and so many foot soldiers, fought for, and the history that we walk into today. It's moving us forward, and it is reminding us where we came from. And the more unshakable we can be in honoring the history of the Voting Rights Act and projecting its future to be just as important and necessary, that's really the outcome here, is that we have a Voting Rights Act and a democracy that's living up to its principles.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. Let's move to questions from our participants tonight. Let's see. I think there's several people that are handling this on our side. Valerie, Sylvia, Kiana, Brooke. Valerie, do you have a question that you got from our audience?
Valerie's no longer on.
Okay.
And I think it's Kiana who's heading up this.
Yes, so I have a question from Lane, unless Lane wants to ask her question. Or
So
you have
go
a few
ahead, you can
questions.
just say it, Kiana.
Okay. What is the gist of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and what's the status in Congress? I believe you kind of touched on it. And what's the outlook on getting it passed, and how can we get it passed?
Sure. So the gist of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is restoring a formula, or restoring a set of rules for what jurisdictions would have to go through the process of getting their voting policies or maps approved by the federal government. So it's looking at, what are those modern forms of Jim Crow? What are those trigger points that when you add them all together says that this state needs more oversight, or this town or this county or parish needs more oversight. It's really looking at how can we modernize those requirements under the Voting Rights Act to be able to build up a sustainable formula moving forward. Are there ways to pull in more states to have more sustainable coverage so that pre-clearance can do what it did for decades, which was stop bad bills, stop bad maps before they went into place, and to give the federal government the power to do that, because right now there's not that, before harm is done safeguard. Essentially the bad stuff has to happen, and then whether it's the Department of Justice or perhaps even more commonly the private bar, nonprofit organizations, lawyers like myself, needing to file on behalf of voters after that indignity has already been, enacted in a bad map, in a discriminatory, unfair map, or in a policy or an administrative decision that does harm to democracy and that indignity to voters and their access themselves. But in terms of the steps ahead, it's been filed in different iterations and different Congresses for years now. I think there are plans to try again. But again, it's really about educating yourself about the legislation. Of course, always reaching out and not taking any leader for granted just based off political party or other assumptions. It's about keeping our eyes on that prize and constantly having it as part of our vocabulary for, the rubric that you're using for leaders, for people who want to represent you. What's their stance on the principles behind that bill, or the idea of having a Voting Rights Act that's fulfilling the vision that LBJ signed into law, 58 years ago.
Very good. Thank you.
The next question was from Jeff. Is there any way that the Louisiana legislator can interfere in the Fifth Circuit to hold up the decision in the Fifth Circuit? I
don't think so, but Tori would know the minutia. I don't think that could happen?
Sure. So I'm trying not to get too wonky. So our lawsuit was actually against the Secretary of State, because that is your chief election administrator who has to then go in and implement, act upon these maps. The legislature went ahead and intervened in both of these cases. So the lawyers, legislative leaders have been trying to put their thumbprint on the legal posture of the cases, on the steps forward, et cetera. So the legislature is represented, the state of Louisiana, essentially the Attorney General's office is in the mix as well too. So there's going to be efforts to delay, maneuver, et cetera. But where we're at right now is we are moving forward with, at the district court level, going through with the remedial process and getting a new map. However, at the same time, that question of liability, was the state guilty to begin with on violating the Voting Rights Act, is pending before the Fifth Circuit. So we have briefed, we're waiting for an oral argument date. And we'll see where that goes as well, but we're not waiting on pushing forward with the new map pending that outcome. And the Fifth Circuit actually already, on the question of whether or not everything should be held up last year, issued a quite favorable ruling on that question and dignified a lot of what the district court did. So to be determined what's going to happen in the Fifth Circuit. It's not always the easiest venue for voting rights litigation and for plaintiffs like ours. But we have, dates and deadlines we're working with. We've got trial dates, hearing dates. We've got the Supreme Court essentially saying, figure it out, and putting our case in concert with Alabama's in many ways in what they did. So there's not too much maneuvering that can happen, but it doesn't mean that, this won't be a fight. There's not going to be endless plot twists along the way, but we're used to those. We're ready for them, and we'll see.
All right.
He also asked if it's possible that the new map would be tossed back to the legislator.
So the legislature has had multiple different opportunities to either call themselves into session, or even last year, they had an opportunity. They did bring themselves into session. They didn't utilize it to enact a fair map. So there are different junctures for both of these cases where the legislature could be given opportunity or could take initiative themselves to come up with a map that would actually, prevail under scrutiny of law. Whether or not they will do that, have done that, I can't predict the future, but I can learn a bit from the past, and they just have not actually taken the opportunity when the court granted it to them to pass a fair map that complies with the Voting Rights Act.
And just as we saw with Alabama, it's not like the legislature was chastened by the Supreme Court. I mean, the people who are often like, we live in a country, rule of law, and then the rule of law came down and they decided to, go against the rule of law. So again, talking about sort of bizarre, contradictory arguments in pursuit of power. Tori can't predict the future, neither can I, but I do a little bit more of it than she does, or, we have different positions, so I'm maybe a little bit freer. I would be willing to bet, all of the money I have, which is not that much, but, obviously represents quite a bit to me, that the legislature has no interest, either the one that we just are, that is cycling out of this fall, or even the one that we will probably see next legislative session, has no interest in coming back and drawing a fair map.
I'd agree with that, Peter. Kiana, next question.
Is there any training available from the ACLU for poll watchers?
So poll watching, as it's defined in Louisiana, is a bit more kind of within the partisan landscape. But in terms of nonpartisan election protection trainings on know your voting rights, how to spot issues, how to ensure that polling sites comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Voting Rights Act and all these other protections to make sure that participation is equally open to everyone. Yes, absolutely. I can't speak for the ACLU, but the Legal Defense Fund, Empower Coalition for Equity and Justice, and many other groups across the state organized together around election season to provide both in-person and virtual trainings. Would be happy to do one of those on one of these calls or another setting with each of y'all. Or you can tune into the virtual trainings that'll be on the calendar for several dates leading up to the October elections. Those will be posted soon on Power Coalition's website, and I can definitely relay information to Betty or many of my other friends on this call to make sure that folks know how to tune in or sign up either in person or online.
Excellent.
And then Lane has another question that she's going to ask herself.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to oh, I know. Who is there a committee that's basically going to address the redistricting, the temporary redistrict, the temporary map? Is there a committee? What is it, if there is? And is their discussion, do they have to make a record? Is their discussion part of the public record? That's my question. And I don't know whether it should go to you, Victoria, or you, Peter.
Sure, I'm sure we can riff off each other a little bit. So based off where we're at, there's a few different things that the court could have done. I'll just speak to the congressional map, but like similar themes will trickle down to the other maps as well. So for the congressional map, once the court determined that the state was liable for violating the Voting Rights Act, she did send it back to the legislature and say, enact a better map. When maps go to the legislature or when the whole redistricting process begins, the committees that have jurisdiction are House and Governmental Affairs and Senate and Governmental Affairs. And they had, during this process, gone around the entire state and had what they call roadshow hearings, building that public testimony and record. All of these videos are online. Louisiana has its own redistricting website. They built that record. They heard testimony from myself, Peter, and a bunch of Louisianians across the state about the principles, about how they wanted their community represented. House and Governmental Affairs and Senate and Governmental Affairs. They are always those committees of jurisdiction looking at redistricting and maps. So that's where, if things went back to the legislature, you'd be seeing those committee meetings or tuning in, participating, showing up in person. When the legislature failed to pass a map, it went back to the court. So the court could have done a few different things here. What we're seeing in Louisiana is the court there has decided to pull in what's called a special master, which is essentially an expert who, takes all the information required and goes about drawing the new map. The court there is also having that special master work with the legal advisor. So the special master process and the idea of bringing in an expert to go about the redistricting process, informed by the public record and other information, but not necessarily the same type of deliberative process that House and Governmental Affairs or Senate and Governmental Affairs went about here. That's common. We have not seen a signal from the court here that she intends to work with the special master. Instead, the court, it seems, will be looking at the recommendations that plaintiffs that we are putting into the record, the map that our expert has produced. Defendants also have an opportunity to introduce a new map or to not, as they haven't in the past. And she presumably will be the one to choose the map. So right now, what we're trying to do is put, the most legally compliant, most representative, most reflective of all that community input testimony, will also balance with the other principles that go into redistricting, like balancing populations, making sure that they are compact, that they don't look completely wonky, that they reflect historic communities and industries or other different factors and what we call communities of interest. All that information goes to demographers. We have an incredible map drawer who's working for plaintiffs here. And we've been able to produce a map pulled last year, and we'll see if the court allows us to provide any revisions to that. We still don't know. But in terms of the record and what's being considered by people, there's not at this phase a new committee or a new kind of public testimony opportunity. Much of that record has already been produced, but that's why we already have to be foreshadowing the public participation, the amount of education you have to do to get people to care and show up in years from now, the census, the count, all of that kind of stuff that goes into that, we have to start that now, because that record needs to be built, and then hopefully the legislatures convinced by it. But if it gets to the courts, that's the data that we're looking at, and that's where community voice and individuals can really have a lot of the impact.
Thank you.
And I think just one quick thing to sum up, because I think a few questions had some of this overlap. The chances of these maps that we're talking about, the ones that are for the 2020s, coming back to the legislature are pretty small at this point. Nor do I know that we would want them to, given what the legislature has done. But we can't, to Tori's point, lose sight of the fact that the census and another redistricting cycle are not that far behind, and the work of not having to spend years in court, it starts now with years ahead of time. But I don't think we should, hopefully not at this point, expect or predict or anything that these particular cases, these particular maps will end up back with the legislature.
All right. Thank you, Peter. And Tori, let me just one quick question. How does one become a witness in these lawsuits?
So we have several different types of witnesses. We have our plaintiffs, the people who we are representing. Plaintiffs here often, are people whose position of power would be, or their opportunity to vote would be implicated the most by the map. So, are you being packed into one district, or are you being excluded from an area that could have another Black majority district, but for the fact that the legislature failed to produce that? So really looking geographically, where do people on an individual level live, and would their opportunity to elect their candidates of choice change? So for that, here, it's been a lot of people who are living near Baton Rouge, or perhaps up near Monroe, or other areas where you could reconfigure a map and provide those voters a new opportunity to elect the candidates that they want. We also, though, have organizational plaintiffs. You can absolutely get involved with your local chapter of the NAACP. You'd be then part of a group that is represented in this matter. Also, Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, Black Voters Matter. All of those groups are engaged in one of these cases or the other, if not both, and organized and brought people to the Capitol and helped build that record, and did so much of that education and the work to make sure that the process at least was inclusive to people's views and opinions and hopes for their state, even if the outcome didn't reflect all of that. So you can definitely get involved with those organizations. But otherwise, to become a plaintiff or a witness, we have lots of other witnesses too. We have experts who are dedicating their careers to analyzing data on representation, on drawing districts. I would love to see, especially for some of the fellows, the folks that are still considering their career paths, consider, the work of being an expert in civil rights litigation. Consider, could I be someone who has the expertise to draw maps professionally, to be able to analyze race and discrimination and speak with the authority of a PhD or history or political science? We contract those folks, and they are up there testifying from their level of expertise and what they can bring to this case. So there's a variety of different ways that we'll end up hearing from people, but it's really whether you're directly impacted as a voter, you have particular expertise on your community, or you have a subject matter area expertise that really helps build up the record that we have to prove on the math, on the science, on the history, on the political science and sociology, all of that. So there's a lot of different pathways, but there's future cases to be filed. If there is a lack of representation in your parish as well, sometimes the way to become a witness is to reach out to civil rights lawyers and let us know that something is awry and the maps are not fair in your parish, your town, or wherever else.
All right, thank you, Tori. Kiana, any more questions either from the chat or right now from anybody?
No,
I
that was
have
it.
one. I wanted to ask about the difference that it makes in terms of the resources that come to a community and which community they come to when a district is changed from majority white to majority Black or majority, Hispanic or whatever. What are the budgetary and monetary and resources that could come that aren't coming now?
Yeah, so Jeff, I mean, there's no formula for that, right? There's no like you get this, but well, the closest thing to formula is actually the census is the first part, right? So so we talk about looking ahead and how do we impact redistricting, thinking about how we get people to care about filling out the census, because that's where I think the financial resources aspect that you're talking about actually comes into play the most, is getting a fair and accurate count. Because what we did see in this last census cycle and in previous census cycles is that communities of color are undercounted, especially relative to white communities, and poorer communities are undercounted relative to wealthier communities. And that helps perpetuate that cycle of inequality on both the racial and economic side. So just on sort of the numbers, I guess, the census plays a huge role in that. Now, when you talk about redistricting of a majority white district to a majority black district, whether it's these congressional seats or state legislative seats, a lot of that then becomes who do you elect, actually? Because I can tell you there are some people who are fantastic at bringing money back to their districts, white or black, whether they're representing a majority white or majority black district. And there are people who are terrible at it. And sometimes they're good at other aspects of politics, but they're really bad at bringing resources back. So there's the first part, which is the census, getting an accurate count, because that's how a lot of federal programs, especially, I mean, huge multi-billion-dollar federal programs, how the money is distributed across the country is based on those census numbers. So that's really, when you talk about that, what shifts the resources, that's probably the most important part from a numbers perspective. Then you get to the redistricting aspect and who is representing it, whether you have a white, black, or another race representative, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, talking to the person who, the candidates about how they're going to bring resources back to your community, especially if you live in a community that is traditionally under-resourced. So there's sort of two sides to that, but I think as far as a formula goes, it has a little bit more to do with the census.
All right. Thank you. I always think too that this census was really negatively impacted by COVID too, and was probably did not give us a fair understanding of where we were. Would you agree with that, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we also got hit by a hurricane. I mean, when you look at the southwest part of Louisiana that got hit by Laura during, destroyed by Laura during the process. And not surprisingly, there was an undercount there. You had a lot of people who had to flee, right? That's always an issue that we have in Louisiana is we have to face more natural disasters than most places. And so again, getting prepared, getting out ahead of it, talking to people now about making sure that, hey, if you end up staying at your grandma's house up in Clinton, because you had to evacuate, that grab that census form, or you go online and fill out the census, because if we want to be able to rebuild wherever it is you are evacuating from, we're going to need to know that you live there, right? Every person who does that is going to be a huge part of how we rebuild.
Absolutely. Good point. Good point. We gotta leave it there. I'm going to ask Tori if you would just leave us with some closing thoughts, and then I'll ask Peter to do the same. Tori, please.
Absolutely. I would say that no matter how you get involved, you can have a thumbprint on the future of fair maps and political representation in Louisiana, whether that's making sure that at minimum you go vote, that you write down 866-R-VOTE and let us know if you had any issues at the polls, volunteer for election protection efforts, or otherwise organize your community. Show up at the federal courthouse on October 3rd through 5th of this year, or on November 27th. That is a public space. You have a right to be in the audience as these determinations are being made for your state. And we'd love to see you there and make sure that you feel like, you can own a piece of this fight and this history. We could not be in court without the record that folks like you all built. We cannot realize the promise of more Black majority districts if we don't then go out and get people registered to vote and to the polls. So really speak about the opportunity that we have here, the importance, the power on the line, and spread the word and just reach out to us if there's anything we can do to support to get you plugged in with these very multi-dimensional opportunities to move democracy forward in Louisiana. We're here, we're a resource, we're a community, and we are very blessed to be here with you tonight and in this fight for the long run.
Thank you, Tori. We are blessed to have you in this fight and as an advocate. And right now, for you being here tonight and giving us your time and your expertise, thank you for all you do. Peter, closing remarks.
Yeah, I just want to point folks to, we have a redistricting page on our website. You can find there a tool called louisiana.redistrictingandyou.org, or you can just go to louisiana.redistrictingandyou.org. It's a really cool map with a slider tool where you can compare Congress, state, Senate, state, House previous maps, and then you pull the slider over and it shows you the current map. So for those of you who are trying to figure out who you're going to vote for, how you're going to vote in this upcoming statewide election, it'll show you if your neighborhood has moved, especially on the state House or state Senate side. We also have some other, I think, interesting, worthwhile resources there that are good to check out. If you missed the link, you go to louisianaprogress.org. Under our Inform tab, there drop down, there's a research page, and we have our redistricting there. And then I just very briefly have to put on my second hat, which is statewide campaign coordinator for the AFL-CIO this year. Just did nominating convention and getting some press out about who the labor unions are backing this year. But really just want to talk about, how important it is to get out and vote in these statewide elections. So often people get focused on the federal election cycle. Louisiana has off-year elections, partially with a racist reasoning and history to it, that off-year elections are meant to reduce voter turnout, particularly in communities that are traditionally disenfranchised. And so as workers, as Black and Brown communities, as conscientious citizens, getting out and voting especially in a lower turnout election, as this is expected to be, let's make it that it's not, right? But if we're gonna change that political power dynamic, we have a huge opportunity coming up in 56 days. The October 14th primary, early voting starts September 30th, runs for 7 days, but 8 days total with a Sunday off. October 1st, no early voting, but other days in that week. And get out and flex your power and vote for candidates who are, I'm not gonna say guaranteed, I'm just gonna say more likely to stand up for the values that I think we've talked about tonight, that the folks on this call are likely to believe in and espouse. And keep an eye out for those AFL-CIO endorsements that are getting out in the press starting today. Maybe those can help guide your own thoughts on who would represent your interests.
Peter, thank you for being here tonight. You're a rock star, and we are blessed and honored to have you in this fight and doing all the incredible work you're doing. So thank you for joining us at Justice and Beyond tonight, and saying that word about getting out and voting. We have to not only get out and vote, but take about 25 other people with us, especially if they live under our roof and are at the age to vote. They need to be out and voting, whether they're cousins, nephews, grandchildren. Get them to the voting booth to vote. It is absolutely imperative, especially during this election. So thank you for those words. Listen, everybody, we're going to close up. As we do, we're going to have, I always like to make sure that we give any time for any candidates that are running for office to speak. I don't know if there are any on the line yet still, but if there are, then you certainly get about 2 minutes to speak. If there are any candidates at this time, please let us know that you are here and wish to speak. All right, not hearing any. Let's go on with any closing announcements. Are there any events that are coming up that we need to be aware of to show up for? We've heard several tonight, but if you know of any, please let us know so that we can be present there as well too. Any announcements at this time?
On Thursday, there's a SAG-AFTRA rally at Armstrong Park, and I apologize, I'm forgetting what time it starts, but it's in solidarity with the striking writers and actors. It's folks who work in film in Louisiana, and they'll be doing an action I believe it's at noon, but don't quote me on that. I have to get the flyer again. But if you're around New Orleans and you want to show some solidarity with some of the biggest strike actions in the world that are happening right now, you can come to Armstrong Park, bring an umbrella, bring some water, make it work in this heat. But the more people, the more solidarity, the more power we have.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Any other announcements?
I have a announcement put on September the 7th, that's September the 7th, on your calendar. And I'm asking everybody to come over to St. Tammany Parish to do some court watching. We don't have any Black judges over here, and we have been challenging our parish to elect a Black judge in our 22nd JDC court. So we're gonna need your support with that. Also, I want to know from Peter, can you email me what you guys anticipate or what you plan to do with working with other grassroots organizations to rally on in October? Are you guys putting together any type of get on the bus, events or anything like that? So I would love to be able to participate in that with some resources. Thank you.
Yeah, so quick answer. So thank you. Lane put in the chat, by the way, that SAG after rallies is from 4:30 to 6:30. So I was way off on my timing. Thank you. It's hard to, a lot of events coming up, so it's hard to keep everything straight. Belinda, great to hear your voice. Always great to hear your voice. The AFL-CIO is, our campaign this year is member to member, which means that we cannot do a lot of the public outreach. It's why I'm talking about just the general idea of getting out to vote and keeping an eye out for the candidates that the AFL-CIO is endorsing. So in terms of being able to provide resources to other grassroots folks, other organizations, unless they decide to change their approach, which is a decision that is way above my head, goes to Washington, D.C., we probably won't be able to do a lot of the stuff you're talking about. I can tell you that for my part, I am trying to convince them to do more of that. But again, decisions made way above my head, and I don't know how much they listen to me. But if they do, then I will circle back to you. I have your number, of course, and I will let you know, as well as everybody else on this call, if some of those opportunities become available.
All right. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Belinda, for bringing that up.
Get that, Peter. Thank you.
Great. Any other announcements? All right. Hearing none, we're going to go ahead and close as we generally do in prayer. And then as we go our separate ways on tonight, let me ask Jeff, Pastor Jeff, would you close us in prayer, please?
Yes, I'd be glad to.
Thank you.
God of justice and love, we thank you for the admonition to use power in the service of love. And so we thank you for these justice warriors that have been talking with us tonight, and for all the work they do and the passion that they put into it, not only the brilliance of mind and the establishment of justice. So we ask, oh God, that you would empower us all in that fight so that we know that we are fighting in the service of love. We ask these things in the name of love itself. God, you are love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Jeff.
Amen.
All right, everybody. Good night. Good night. Good to see you. Be well, be kind, empathetic, compassionate one to another. And we'll see you back real soon. God bless you.
God
Bye-bye.
bless.